From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for the opportunity to be here in such an esteemed location, Library of Congress, and within this department, both of North Africa and also of the Middle East, where the Coptic Church, and indeed Egypt, finds itself a member of both delineations. We pride ourselves on being the largest Christian denomination in the Middle East, while having our origins firmly in Africa, having a good connection with the churches and the heritage throughout the sub-Saharan African section and throughout the Middle East as well. I must start by saying that the term Coptic is quite confusing, and if I were to say to you that this church was a Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or Eritrean Orthodox or Ethiopian Orthodox, it would make sense because of the cultural and the ethnic delineation. But Coptic just means Egyptian. It comes from the Greek word Aegyptos, meaning Egypt, and earlier from the Pharaonic Aegypta. I learned a lesson very early on not to take shortcuts when describing what Coptic meant. I've told this story before that usually when I introduce myself, I speak about the Coptic Church and I say Coptic, Greek, Russian, long introduction. One day I was in a little bit of a rush going to one of our parishes in the west of England, and I stopped at a service station to refuel my car, and I was in quite a rush. Saw a scruffily dressed gentleman with a rucksack and a sign. And he said, "Good afternoon, Padre." And I said, "Oh, good afternoon." He said, "So, which church are you from?" And I said, "I'm really not in the mood for Greek, Russian, Indian, Ethiopian." So I just took the shortcut and said, "I'm Egyptian Orthodox." He said, "Oh, so you're Coptic." Turned out to be a lapsed theologian. So that's why I go to the painstaking terms of explaining what Coptic means, so I don't get caught out by that again. The Copts are the indigenous people of Egypt, having been there since the 1st century, preached by St. Mark, the writer of the second Gospel, and recipients of the message of Christianity as early as that. Christianity has therefore been in Egypt since the 1st century, an unbroken heritage through the church being mainstream, Trinitarian, conservative, traditional, depending on the writings of the fathers, scriptural, and holding to the life and practice, not only in the realms of teaching and theology, but everyday life of every Christian throughout Egypt. It currently represents about 15% of the population of Egypt. So, as I said, it is the largest Christian denomination in the Middle East until today. The historical perspective is that being preached by St. Mark and established in the 1st century, Egypt was a majority Christian country speaking Coptic. Many people are confused by Coptic. Coptic is the language that succeeded Pharaonic, but uses Greek script. So if you read Greek, you would walk into a church and see the script on the iconography, or in our liturgical books, our lectionaries, and you'd be able to recognize the lettering. It has an additional 8 letters that did not exist within the Greek language. This was the case until the year 642 with the Arab conquest of Egypt, where gradually, as time went on, the culture was replaced by an Arabization of Egypt, and the language was replaced generally with the use of Arabic. Coptic maintains itself as our liturgical language, being used extensively, but also remains as a spoken language for some throughout the world who will continue to use it on a daily basis until today. We see Christians, Coptic Christians of Egypt, going through the early 7th century, through the caliphates, through a transformation which, in the words of Gladys France Murphy in a study, said that it was a transformation at a glacially slow pace. It happened over centuries. It wasn't overnight. Over that time, there was a maintaining of the heritage and practice of the Christians in their own language, with its own dialects, in their own culture and in their own belief. The knowledge of Greek and Coptic did not immediately disappear, but it continued, and it continued to be a means of the conduct of their daily life. Egyptians continued to worship in Greek and Coptic, as evidenced by the survival of the Greco-Coptic bilingual dictionaries until today. By the 11th century, legal documents had generally been changed to Arabic throughout Egypt. Generally speaking, by the year 900 AD, Egypt was transformed into Dar al-Islam, the Islamic nation. And the Abbasid caliphs became the leadership of the majority Muslim state as it stood at that time. Another interesting transformation then was the resurgence of the Islamic ulama, the scholars. And matters of law, matters of practice and appropriateness were then deferred to the scholars, giving an even greater tinge of religiously led life in Egypt. There were between 1293 and 1354 AD 4 separate campaigns launched against those who had dhimmi status. And in particular, there was a transformation in the place of those people, although protected by attacks, but the general trend towards them. And there was a pressure taking many forms that sanctioned and enforced the Mamluk government to slowly but surely shrink the Christian presence within that realm. Although dhimmi status, Ahlul Dhimma, started to take greater shape and started to define the presence of Egyptians, Christian Egyptians in Egypt, people were still able to stay and worship, but in a much less evident way, because this was seen to be offensive to some who were still there. There was a wave of religious persecution that came around the 13th and 14th century, and it changed the demographics of Egypt. Over 60 years between 1293 and 1354 AD, Egypt was transformed from an 80% majority Christian nation to a 14% minority Christian nation. A percentage that seems to hold until today, where the general perception is that the Coptic Christians represent about 15% of the population of Egypt. In the year 1354, some 7 centuries after the Arab conquest, there was a turning point in Egypt in which its appearance, its life, its nature was transformed. But I think we need to hold one thing very important, and that is that the story of the Copts in Egypt is not a story of persecution and defeat. It is a story of strength, resilience, adaptability, and survival. Although over the 2,000 years of the existence of Copts in Egypt, Copts have been the recipients, I think, of one of the titles of those who have experienced the greatest waves of persecution and martyrdom. We are still a vibrant community within an Islamic state, within an Islamic region. The churches are full, the monasteries are full, the Christians continue to live their lives, not provocationally by any way, but in a spirit of love, in a spirit of tolerance, in a spirit of knowing that they are, in essence, and by origin, Egyptian, although marginalized. It's very difficult to distinguish between the Egyptian origin and the Christian reality of the Copts of Egypt. One telltale sign of this is that although we have seen mass exodus of Christians from the Middle East, from many countries where Christianity was there for millennia, from Iraq, from Syria, from the Palestinian territories, from throughout the region, a vast 90% of Coptic Christians still live in Egypt. So those outside of Egypt represent between 10 and possibly 15% of the population of all Coptic Christians in the world. The Copts today, because of all of this background, have found themselves relegated to the confines of the church as the most comfortable place of existence, having been marginalized and alienated by a society that has become much more Arab, much more Islamic. The Copts have resorted to the church being more of their identity, while still holding on to their Egyptian origins. That can be very clearly seen when we looked at the 25th of January, that faithful day where contemporary Egypt changed. And we had tens, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians out in Tahrir Square who are celebrating a very new start. You could see these people filling the square, not being able to distinguish Christian from Muslim, young and old, all who were there to celebrate their Egyptianness and almost a reclaiming of national identity and an ability to be Christians and Muslims together, but primarily and foremost Egyptians side by side. This unfortunately didn't last because the prior decades had not built a spirit of social unification or cohesion. And unfortunately that has gone by the wayside. But we still hope that that spirit continues in the hearts of every Egyptian, and that once again Egyptians, Christians and Muslims alike can look at themselves being primarily Egyptian. So the dependence on the church became paramount. And the church then started to be the comfortable realm and the provider. Because of these dynamics, the pastoral ministry of the church became the savior and the protector of Coptic Christians. If we look at the role of the church, it's extensive. In its pastoral ministry, through its Christian education programs, ranging from the youngest children in Sunday school, through to youth programs, to young adults programs, and through its adult ministries. We are reported to have at least 10,000 Sunday school teachers in Cairo alone, which gives you the scope and the extent of Christian education and how it supports people. In terms of the youth ministry of the church, it is one of the most vibrant sections. The late Pope Shenouda III, who passed away just last year, and who actually was one of the driving forces of Christian education, and who had a famous saying, which was that a church without youth is a church without a future. And so we see extensive investment. Throughout the world, there are tens of youth conferences annually. And there is a diversity of youth ministries. We are very, very blessed with a community, a Coptic community, that is so gifted in so many ways. Just to give you an indication, in the United Kingdom alone, we run 15 different youth programs, going through the broad spectrum of general youth ministry, educational ministry, cultural ministry, arts ministry, sports ministry, and everything else that comes in between. To be able to give every person the ability to both enjoy and express him or herself in the way in which they feel most comfortable. This gives an opportunity for the Copts to express themselves and to grow as a community, being vibrant, visible, productive, cooperative members of the societies in which they live. I'm always proud to tell people that as a church, we are not exclusive. We don't close ourselves off. And that is exemplified by the vast variety of outreach ministries that have not only been spurred on today, but have been there since the early centuries. The church has had an incredible contribution. Coptic Christians throughout the centuries have contributed significantly to the ecumenical life of the church at large, as it has developed. Whether it be Athanasius, with his contribution to the Athanasian Creed, Cyril of Alexandria, Dioscorus, all of our fathers who are recognized across the world, across the ecumenical life of the Church of God, and who are seen to be contributors, accepting the first three councils and being members of those councils in every aspect. We see a continuation of the life of the Church and its ecumenical role today. Being members of the World Council of Churches, the All-African Council of Churches, the Middle Eastern Council of Churches, the Australian Council of Churches, KEC in Europe, and various European instruments, Churches Together in England, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, the Council of Oriental Orthodox Churches, and many other such bodies globally, as well as its dialogues, both official and unofficial, with the Eastern Orthodox family of churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Communion, the Evangelical Alliance, and a broad spectrum of other expressions. We see that the spirit of the Copts that started in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries continues today in a very real way. Likewise, in another significant contribution, and that is of monasticism. We have great fathers of monasticism. St. Anthony the Great, St. Shenouda, St. Pachomius. People who established the great orders of monasticism as they are known today. The Hermetic order, the Cenobitic order, the communal order. Basically, if you look at any member of any monastic order anywhere in the world, their origins are in the deserts of Egypt, because that's where it started. John Cassian, St. Benedict, people who went and who took that spirit of monasticism and brought it back into the West, and from there it ignited. I can't tell you how it makes me feel when I walk through any airport, anywhere in the world, and I see a Catholic nun or a Franciscan brother. I instantly feel a connection, because our origins are in those great fathers. And again, until today, being in quite a peculiar situation amongst churches, our monasteries are flourishing. We actually turn people back because we don't have enough space for them. We're building new accommodation. I make the observation to many people that, as in the West, every boy wants to grow up to be a fireman. In Egypt, they won't grow up to want to be monks. And that is because the monastic life has been such a pillar of the church, a pillar of Copts. Until now, those monasteries are a place of sanctity, havens. In the midst of turmoil, you will still get busloads of people going to retreats. When I was still in the monastery, I remember walking out one day and seeing what I thought were thousands of people. And I went up to the monk who was responsible for the guests and said, "How many people do you have coming through?" This was a public holiday. 10,000 people went through the monastery that day. Busload after busload would come and then move on to the next monastery. In England at the moment, they do things called pub crawls, where they'll start on an evening and start from one pub or bar and go to the next. In Egypt, we do it a little bit differently. They do monastery crawls. They'll start from Alexandria with the monastery of St. Mina, work through Wadi Natrun and the monasteries there, and sometimes even go into Cairo and visit the convents there. It is such a rich and vibrant history and heritage that lives until today. I remember being in the monastery, and I was there for 6 years. But towards the end of my time there, I went through it. There's a small tunnel that links the church with the refectory. And as I went through that tunnel, I suddenly felt shivers up and down my spine. I don't know why at that instant it clicked that monks had been walking up and down this tunnel for 1,500 years. People who lived the life I lived when I was there. And people who lived a life that inspired me and so many others to continue to live, not only in Egypt, but throughout the whole world. In the realm of interreligious, interfaith dialogue, I want to reassure you that it is not such a nuance in Egypt. We've been doing it for 1,500 years. It was not post any calamity. It was not post any act. It has become a way of life. Christians and Muslims living in Egypt, for the most part peacefully. When they are focused on who they are and they live as they are called, Egyptians live side by side. We see the wonderful relationship that was there between the late Pope Shenouda III and various grand imams of Al-Azhar. And we see how they were able to stand side by side on so many issues. Ethical, moral, family, social, even political. And they're able to proclaim together. And that is the Egypt that the Copts are used to. But the changing dynamics have not led Copts to live in any different sort of way. They still fill their churches. They still fill their monasteries. They still fill their homes with their prayers. They are still valued and valuable members of their communities, being some of the most successful in Egypt and throughout the world. I was quite impressed to read the recent Diaspora Report commissioned by Coptic orphans and conducted here to say that the vast majority of Christians outside of Egypt had some sort of tertiary qualification. It's not because that makes you any better or worse, but whether you are educated, whether you are a doctor, whether you are a farmer, whoever you are in Egypt, there's an idea of being faithful, being the person who shows forth who they are. And for us as Copts, it is our presence as Christians and our being light in the world. And so therefore, again, with that heritage of coexistence, we find ourselves today engaged in interreligious and interfaith dialogues, both in Egypt, throughout the Middle East, and around the world. Hopefully, being agents of peace and cohesion, being agents of love and coexistence. In short, the Copts have been and continue to be the people of Egypt. The Copts have been and continue to be faithful contributors and a faithful foundation of the society. The Copts have been and continue to be strong in their witness, strong in their proclamation, gracious in their lives, and gracious in their acceptance of all around them. To be Coptic is not to be a freedom fighter. To be Coptic is not to be one who stands and causes abrasion. To be Coptic is to live according to these principles that I have demonstrated today. True to their faith, true to their society and their nation, true to their God, true to themselves, and above all, true to the nature, the image, the likeness, the preparedness, the spirit that is within them. So when you see a Coptic Christian, understand that he or she comes from a very long heritage, a heritage of millennia, in one of the oldest nations, expressing one of the truest forms of Christianity, living one of the most faithful practices of Christianity, and demonstrating strength, resilience, and adaptability that has seldom been seen in many people throughout history. Thank you.